Professor Tim Luckhurst is a former BBC executive. He's now the principal of South College at Durham University. And just before I speak to him, I just want to remind ourselves what the BBC said about Nigel Farage earlier today.
He has said that this is now a matter of national security.
Nigel Farage with his customary inflammatory language there at a Reform UK press conference. He declined to stand for a seat.
That presenter is called Geeta Guru-Murthy, and about an hour later she issued this apology.
Now, an apology. Earlier today, we heard live from Nigel Farage speaking at that election event we just saw. And when we came away from his live speech, I used language to describe it, which didn't meet the BBC's editorial standards on impartiality. I'd like to apologise to Mr Farage and viewers for this.
Tim, what do you make of this controversy? Why do you think she said what she said? Because that's not what BBC presenters are meant to do.
Well, that's certainly not what BBC presenters are supposed to do, and that's why the BBC were absolutely adamant that she must apologise. Why did she say it? I suppose one could take the view that there are quite a lot of people working for the BBC who see the left of politics as being more virtuous than the right of politics. Now, that's certainly not in obedience to BBC guidelines. It's certainly not the BBC's position. But when you've got a culture in a newsroom where most of your friends come from one perspective, most of your friends think the same thing about an idea, there's often an opportunity for that to slip out on air, whether you intended it to or not, and that gets the BBC into trouble. Now, I think that's a shame because the BBC's rules are firm on impartiality, and that's why Geeta Guru-Murthy apologised so promptly and apologised sincerely to Nigel Farage. But the BBC needs to work hard to make sure that that culture doesn't get embedded in newsrooms. Do you
think it is embedded?
I don't think it's embedded in most mainstream BBC newsrooms, but there may be occasionally a group of staff on duty at the same time who all share the same outlook and who wouldn't think that something along those lines was outrageous and wrong. And it's very important that the BBC always points out that it is outrageous, that impartiality means impartiality, and that you cannot criticise those with whom you personally disagree. Indeed, you can't allow your personal politics to emerge when you're presenting for the BBC. You're supposed to be entirely neutral, unbiased and impartial, and that's a failure whenever that standard is not maintained.
Tim, I actually worked for the BBC for a number of years, and I know you did, no doubt about that, Tim. But certainly, I mean, I remember being in the BBC's Westminster office. I was working for Newsnight at the time as a political producer, but there are lots of different people. As you know, their Westminster office in Millbank has lots of different producers from lots of different programmes. It's a kind of a bureau, and lots of different programmes have their presenters, or have some presenters, but mainly producers working there. And I promise you, this was in 2010, and I was absolutely horrified when it was the Labour leadership election, which we in Newsnight were covering very, very closely. And there was one particular producer who was going around asking people, who are you voting for in the Labour leadership election? I said, I'm sorry, what do you mean? You need to be a member of the Labour Party to vote in that election. And he said, well, many people in this office are. And I wonder whether you think it's appropriate. Now, this is an anecdotal example. I'm not expecting you to defend anything, but the point is that there are people in the BBC who are members of political parties. I was never a member of a political party when I worked for the BBC. Is that something people should be allowed to do?
I don't think that it would be legal for the BBC to say that in a democracy people are not entitled to be members of a political party. But like you, I take the view that to be a journalist at the BBC and a card-carrying member of a political party is almost certainly shooting yourself in the foot, if not conveying a very poor impression of your employer. I was not a member of a political party when I worked for the BBC. I had previously worked as an advisor to a member of the Shadow Cabinet, but I gave up my party membership the day before I joined the BBC, and I have not been a member of a political party at any time while working in any way for the BBC. I'm not a member of a political party now. I doubt I will ever be a member of a political party again. I want to be seen to be neutral, impartial and objective, and that's what I try very hard to achieve.
And you are achieving it, believe me, Tim, and it's so important as well in education with so many young minds at Durham University. I suppose the question I want to ask you is, from a talk viewer and listener perspective, there are a lot of people who are really very sceptical about the BBC, who feel they are forced to pay their licence fee or decide not to. I would imagine our viewers and listeners have a higher proportion of viewers and listeners to this station than many others who don't pay their licence fee, who decide not to engage with the BBC at all. What would you say to them about the fact that this is, in many people's minds, a jewel in the crown of Britain, a jewel in the crown worldwide? The BBC World Service is revered in many different countries. Yet there are many people, myself included, who have a bit of a scepticism about whether the BBC can actually be relied upon to be impartial, to do what it says on the tin, to do what we have to pay our licence fee to do.
I think that would be a huge mistake. After all, the core lesson that I was taught when I joined the Today programme all the way back in 1988 was that if both the left and the right thought that we were biased against them, we were probably doing something absolutely right. And it was always the case that the Labour Party accused us of being pro-Conservative and the Conservative Party accused us of being pro-Labour. And as long as that was the case, I thought that we were doing our job very well indeed. And I was very proud to work for the BBC for the many years during which I did work for the BBC in quite senior roles. I don't think that the BBC sets out to be in any way biased. Indeed, I think that the BBC is profoundly impartial, and that's why it's so widely respected as a jewel of British cultural diplomacy, as well as a trusted broadcaster around the world. So I don't think when individuals make mistakes, one should attribute those errors to a culture within the BBC. The culture within the BBC is one of rigid impartiality, and that is drummed into every BBC journalist, and 99 out of 100 BBC journalists achieve that standard every day. Occasionally, one makes a mistake, and when they do, they should make a full apology. That's what happened today. It shouldn't have happened, but it has happened, and I hope that it won't happen again.
And actually, to be fair to the BBC, I remember when something similar like this happened when I worked for the BBC, and there were a lot of people who do work hard for the BBC, very, very annoyed because they'll say, this reflects on all of us. And actually there will be people who won't have seen a minute of the BBC News Channel today, and that it will be their only impression of the BBC today, and indeed in the coming days, perhaps even for the whole election.
Well, that's certainly true, because the BBC's many critics, and it does have many critics in the newspaper press and in independent broadcasting, will always pick up on such errors and highlight the fact that a BBC presenter has shown a lack of impartiality. Well, I don't blame opponents and those who are competing with the BBC for doing that, but it is an indication of how high the BBC standards are, that the apology was quick, the apology was absolutely precise, the apology sounded sincere, and I believe it was sincere, and the BBC absolutely insisted that such apologies must be made, because it is absolutely outrageous for any presenter to convey the impression that the BBC will tolerate partiality of that kind. I'm glad that the apology was made, and I think the issue is now closed.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. That's Tim Luckhurst there, Professor Tim Luckhurst, former BBC executive, who is principal of South College at Durham University. Just